It gives me great pleasure to welcome on stage Liz Alderman, Chief European Business Correspondent of the New York Times, and her panelists for this session, Woman, Life, Freedom, Iran, What Next?
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه.
Is there anybody in this room who is not moved by hearing that song? I don't think so. Is there anybody in this room who doesn't know that song? I think that's probably not possible since 40 million people have heard it on the internet. And that song is, of course, Baraye, which I know I'm mispronouncing, but it has become the rallying cry for the protests that have taken place in Iran ever since the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in police custody after she was taken in by the Iranian morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab incorrectly. More than 2.5 months later, the protests are still going strong, but as we've seen, the crackdown has also been very strong by the Iranian regime. And the question now, at this very pivotal moment, is what's next? I'm Liz Alderman, a European correspondent for the New York Times based here in Paris, and it is my pleasure and my honor to welcome this panel this evening of Iran experts who have been focused on pretty much almost nothing but this very issue. Let me start with you, Mahnaz Shirali. You're a sociologist, a political scientist, and a specialist on Iran at the IPAG Business School. You've been following this closely. You know people on the inside. Let me just ask you to very briefly just bring us up to date, if you would, on what is the state of the movement at this point in time? And explain to us also how it is that in a still quite conservative Iranian society, the death of this young woman, this Gen Zer, has galvanized so many people to rise up and to pose really the biggest challenge to the Islamic Republic since its founding.
Merci beaucoup pour votre invitation. Je suis
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am especially delighted to be with you tonight because I have the impression that with such meetings, conferences, we are able to amplify, to pass on the voice of Iranian women and Iranian youth in general. So thank you very much to all of you. What is happening in Iran is of significance. It's been happening since mid-September. It's very important to take into account what's taking place in Iran, because the more we pay attention, the more lives we save, the more we can prevent the Islamic Republic from slaughtering these young people who are taking the streets to require freedom. We have a country in this world where people die just because they want to live freely, such as we the same way we live here. That's why I think we are responsible. We have to do something, look at this country and prevent the Islamic Republic, the leaders of this country, from slaughtering these people. The youth there are well organized thanks to social networks. They get organized through social networks, through Twitter on an everyday basis. Thanks to these social networks, they manage to structure their movement. And the result is that 2 months down the line, they're still on the streets and fighting bare hands a regime that is fighting them fully armed. This pushes for admiration. We cannot remain indifferent for these people who want to live at least a couple of minutes free before dying, who want to feel freedom. They are organized, reorganized through social networks, through Twitters, all sorts of applications, Telegram, all that you can imagine. They use these social networks to meet, to get organized, to meet again. And we see that after 40 years, when women were struggling on their own in Iran, men are by their side. They support them. Something of significance has taken place in this country. That is, Iranian men, young men, understood that the freedom of women is not in opposition with their power, with their freedom. What is happening is of huge significance. Iranian men understood that the freedom of their country goes through the freedom of women.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And, you know, that leads me to a question for Roya. We're really pleased to have Roya Boroumand with us tonight. She's the executive director of the Abdorrahman Boroumand Center for Human Rights in Iran and a long-time human rights activist. And of course, one of the major, developments, in the protests is the continued very violent efforts at repression by this regime. My colleagues at the New York Times, as well as in other newspapers, have been chronicling and documenting just how hard the crackdown has been, especially on young people, even children. More than 15,000 arrests, hundreds of deaths, and now the death penalty being handed out. Roya, talk to us, if you would, about, in the face of such violence, what is it that continues to motivate them? And I mean, how long do you think people will be able to keep hanging on?
Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for the question. I think it's important to have to put these events in their historical contexts. I mean, women, if people are in the streets and women are in the streets, it's not because they cherish martyrdom the way the 1970s revolutionary did. This fight is existential for them. They're out because pervasive discrimination over 4 decades has impacted their public lives and their private life and has turned them into second-class citizens. It's because they have tried all different ways to bring about change, and they have faced the wall. Each time they have faced the wall. And so I think it's important to understand what the stakes are here and why they are braving death every day for so long. In 1979, the 1979 revolution was an assault on the rule of law, and the executions we document testify to it, the thousands of executions, but it was also, and before anything else, an assault on the rights that women had fought so hard to gain. It was no accident that the first law that the new revolutionary leaders abrogated was the family protection law. It's no accident that they brought the age of maturity to 9 for girls and 15 for boys, allowing thousands of girls being married at 10 years old and 12 years old. It is no accident that the criminal law valued the life of a woman as half of a man and her testimony as half of that of a man. Women and controlling women, 50% of the population, was the revolutionary leaders' way of controlling the citizens at large. They started with women because men mostly didn't react. And today, as you said, you know, men have joined the fight because they understand that this is existential and it's about all of them. But women, it wasn't that easy. It didn't happen easily. Women came out in the street in 1979, in March 1979, tens of thousands of them, to protest the mandatory veil, the idea of mandatory veil, and they were humiliated and beaten, and for 2 decades, the whole country, the civil life, the political life was shut down. But then when there was some opening, they tried again. They tried by working with reformers in the system, among the revolutionaries. They organized their own civil society organizations. They had campaigns to raise awareness and get signatures against discriminatory laws. They had public events, public gatherings and protests, and each time they were beaten up, they were arrested, their organizations were closed down. A lot of them are now in exile, others in prison, and others are silent. So they did try, but the path to change is blocked. That's why they are in the streets, because they can't have political parties if they don't believe in the discriminatory tenets of the Islamic Republic. They can't run for election, and even if they do, and even if by miracle a law passes in the parliament, there is an unelected body, Guardian Council, that blocks all the laws, which it has done, including for the Convention on the elimination of discrimination against women.
So, I mean, I think that's a very important point that you just made, and I would love to jump off of that point to go over to Nazenin Ansari. You are an Iranian journalist. You're based in London. You're the managing editor of Kayhan.London, the only Iranian newspaper, you know, operating outside of the country, a Persian language newspaper. You're very plugged in to the people inside and to what's going on. I mean, what we've been hearing here is that, you know, this is a very significant and meaningful movement, especially put in the historical context that Roya just described. But what is it that makes this time different? Because we have seen, as she just described, a number of large protests, you know, since this regime, you know, took power in 2009, 2019. What is going to make this time different? Will this time really be different?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, as you mentioned, there have been a lot of attempts to change the regime. In the beginning of the revolution, there was a coup d'etat, the Nojit coup d'etat. Then we went to 1999, the student protests. Then we had 2003, then we had 2009, 2017, 2019, and now we've got 2022. And between 2019 and 2022, we've had daily protests all over the country. And as Roya mentioned, they were trying to see whether they could work through the system, but it didn't work. What is different about this time? Number one, in previous demonstrations or protests or events, we wouldn't see so many women. There were basically men who were out on the streets. The student movement, there were male students. We wouldn't see so many women. So this time that is different. Secondly, whereas before they would be concentrated and atomized so that the regime would be able to really come in and arrest everybody like they did in 2017 or 2019 or 2009 for that matter. Within 5 days in 2019, they closed down the internet, and there are reports between 1,500 to 6,000 were killed under the shadow of, under darkness of information. But this time they haven't done that. We're still getting information out. Why is it that this time they haven't been able to really manipulate it or be able to stop it? And that's because it is dispersed. The same way that the regime has increased its apparatus, the crackdown and the brutal crackdown, the same way the people who have been against Iranians have also developed their methodology. And whereas in 2019 or 2009, they were able to really arrest the managers on the ground. This time, you mentioned 15,000, which is a statistics from 2-3 weeks ago. By now, we've seen statistics of 18,000 arrests.
Growing exponentially.
Yes, and they still can't stop the protests. Yeah. So that's another reason. And also, although the engine of this protest are the Z generation, Generation Z, those who were born between 1997 and 2010. But this time, what they are looking for, it is shared, and their aspirations are shared across the population. Only a few days ago, one of the regime insiders, Mr. Abdi, had an interview, and Abbas Abdi has been very active in producing pollings inside Iran. And he was saying, and this interview was done in Iran with regime-affiliated production, but he was saying, first of all, why don't you allow the polls to be published? And if you do, you will realize that although you see, people, scattered demonstrations, but at least 80% are behind these protesters. So that is something else. And now, another thing is that they've become political. You only have to listen to the slogans that they're looking beyond the Islamic Republic. They don't want the Islamic Republic. They don't want dictatorship. They say death to dictator. They don't want, after Mr. Khamenei, his son to be able to take over, which is in the plans. So, and as well, and I'll finish here, is that recently there was a hacking by a group of hackers, and they hacked into not only the nuclear sites, but they hacked into also the Fars News Network, and which is affiliated to IRGC, and they were able to bring out a lot of recordings. And in those recordings, we learn that, number one, the protests and the demonstrations are more widespread than the regime admits. Number two, that the people, the security forces are tired, and they are complaining. And number three, that from protests now it has expanded into strikes. And over 22 provinces in Iran have been on strike. This means that the business is also behind these demonstrations.
Well, it's very significant. I mean, if indeed, the backing for the movement has become that widespread in the country. And Sahand, Saber, I want to ask you a follow-up, a political question, actually, about this. Very happy to have a man on this panel as well, Sahand Saber, who's a lawyer at Paris-based HIRO Avocat. And also a close observer of the situation in Iran. I want to ask you a question about male participation. But before I do that, just bouncing off of what Nazenin just said, I mean, what is the likelihood that this regime will implement actually a political solution to this? What we're seeing is, again, evidence of wider and wider support in the average population, but also certainly, Iran does remain to a certain extent a conservative country. What is the likelihood that the regime will actually change and give way? I mean, is a political solution likely? What is that conversation like, do you think, right now in the offices of the president, for example?
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for having me. Je vais répondre en français. Alors, la question,
okay, so I'm going to speak French. The question is to know if there can be a solution, a political solution that's offered by the regime. I'd like to say that this hypothesis has already been on the table, and it's been on the table for quite some time now. It's been mentioned several times, both by Irani people and the international community. The idea would be to adopt a behavior that respects international laws, respects international treaties of basic rights of Iranian people. Now, you can see one thing when you go over history of the Iranian people. Firstly, the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, had said from the get-go, before he got to Iran, said he'd never respect these promises. And actually, when Saddam Hussein launched a military attack on Iran, he presented the war and said it's an opportunity. And that's actually how he did everything to continue this war, to pursue this war that killed 1 million people. And when you look at the history of the Islamic Republic, you see it's a succession of crises. As was said, there were the student riots of 1999, 2003, 2009, to 2011, 2017, 2019, now 2022. Why? Because this regime can only exist thanks to crises, thanks to defiance. And the nuclear program is actually a program of defiance to constrain, to force the international community to deal with them. And every single time, this is what happened. The nuclear issue was on the table. It was a condition for negotiations. We'll negotiate on nuclear powers if you forget human rights. And that is how the nuclear issue was used as a bargaining chip in a regime that cannot reform itself, cannot find a solution from the get-go that would satisfy the Iranian people, that would meet the aspirations of the Iranian people. And what we see is that Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, tweets in French, English, and all languages. And he always does it with the same semantics. He always talks of the enemy. That's a word that keeps cropping up. Why the enemy? If there's no enemy, there's no reason for this regime to exist. So we need to say, well, chances have been given to this regime. Why is there a revolution nowadays? Well, today, because from the inside we come to the conclusion that they've had every single chance possible, but this regime does not want to adapt to the evolutions of the world. So the women's issue is central because it's the lowest common denominator between all Iranian people, be they rich or poor, be they from this community or this religion. All Iranian people nowadays have this fear. As Ms. Alderman asked me, what makes an Iranian man nowadays? Why could an Iranian man feel concerned by the issues of Iranian women? Sorry. Now, going back to this legend of Iranian football, Mr. Ayedoli said at the beginning of a demonstration, he said this on the murder of Mahsa Amini. He said, I want to give a satisfactory answer for my daughter, to explain what happened to Mahsa Amini, and I can't do this. So we are currently in a situation of incapacity. He's unable to answer his own daughter. Like all Iranian men, he is scared. He's scared his daughter's not going to make it home one night. So that has fed into all the other demonstrations. As was said earlier on, men in Iran have been aware for a long time now, but what they say is that human rights cannot get any footing in Iran if women's rights are not defended, for rights of minorities. Often you talk about democracy as a dictatorship of majorities and its protection of minorities, and that's something that the Iranian people have understood. Take this country. It's an extremely wealthy country, but it's very poor nowadays. The wealth is amazing. Oil, gas, gold mines. We found amazing things in Iran. But in winter in Iran, people are still dying of cold. This is a situation which the Iranian people just do not understand. And they understand that the way for the modernization of a country will be secularization, and that goes through the defense of women's rights. And we can go even further. Actually, in a day, there was a Shah of Iran in 1925. In 1941, the story says that he'd had the visit of the Afghan emperor. And the wife of the emperor of Afghanistan, so the queen of Afghanistan, had come to Iran with no veil. And she was faced with these clerics who'd rebelled against this. She was extremely fun, and he was impressed by this woman who was faced by these clerics who were asking her to wear the Islamic veil, and she said no. So those are the
foundations, the first stones of Iranian secularism, but it's a proof that the evolution and modernization of society cannot go without the protection of women and society.
Point. Very powerful. But I mean, to the point that, you know, this is, okay, we've got all of these protests that are continuing despite, you know, the widening crackdown. And yet this is a regime that you're saying, you know, still doesn't want to adapt. One of the images that we saw coming out on social media that was so powerful was actually of these young people going around and doing what they were calling turban tipping, taking the turbans off of clerics, right? I mean, at great risk to themselves. And I mean, what the regime, to what extent is this regime just simply completely out of step with what the demands, you know, of the people are today? And I mean, at what point do we reach a breaking point? Mahnaz.
Toujours.
Good evening. I've always said there is no regime that's more solid than a dictatorial regime that kills its own citizens. The regime is extremely strong. They do not hesitate to kill. So we saw this in the past few months. The massacres were far stronger in the cities that are far from the Iranian capital, for example, in the Kurdish regions, in the Kurdistan region, and other regions. So these are regimes that kill. This is a regime that kills, that does not hesitate to kill, except if the international community were to pressurize the regime. So we are counting, the Iranian people are counting on the pressure of the international community. So what is going to bring this regime down? I think the Iranian people just can't do it. They're extremely strong. They are armed. They will not hesitate in killing half the population. But I am counting on the international community's pressure. We are basically just ahead of major massacres. On the 21st of November, the Islamic Republic launched toxic gases in one of their cities. So the use of chemical weapons, which is banned, which was signed, the Islamic Republic signed the Convention on the Banning of Chemical Weapons for not respecting it. So I'd like to say this. We are in the 21st century, and in the 21st century, we can no longer stay in place. We can no longer govern a country by killing its citizens.
To your point, one of the nieces of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was arrested, as you know, last week after she condemned what she called the, quote, murderous regime. She has called on foreign governments to cut ties with the Iranian regime. I mean, Nazenin, do you think that will happen?
Well, yes. You know, one of
Roya
the, if I may just say, there is this law in economics called the law of diminishing returns. And that is, no matter how, when you keep increasing the seeds that you plant, you won't get as much produce. And this is what's happened in Iran. The more crackdown there has been, and the more security services have cracked down and bodies being created, we've seen more protests. So there is that, I think we have passed that threshold that crackdown really will shut up people. It will not. Mm-hmm. And secondly, what is different this time is, whereas before, the world wasn't behind the women of Iran, wasn't behind Iranians. This time, as the German foreign minister said before the UN Human Rights Council vote, she said, you know, we know that Iranians don't have any voice at the UN Human Rights Council, neither do they have it at the United Nations. That's why Germany plus Iceland plus 55 other countries decided to be the voice of Iranians. So this is what has changed. The world is behind us. But as far as what to do, Yes, Mrs. Farida Moradkhani, along with Masih Ali-Nejad, Dr. Shirin Ebadi, they've all asked for closing down of diplomatic relations, closing down of embassies. But just recently, 6,000 cultural figures of Iran signed a statement. And what they asked for is that for the international community, that's museums, art institutions, cultural institutions, to stop working with regime-affiliated institutions and entities. That's number one. And we saw, for example, when the European Union brought a sanction against one internet company based in Europe who was filtering and providing cloud service for the Islamic Republic. Once they sanctioned that and the company here was closed, a lot of sites were no longer filtered and Iranians could could access information. But I think one other thing which is very important and what activists always ask is for safe spaces for communication inside Iran. It's communication. This is a networked movement. You don't see a leader. You see many, many people on the streets and they're networked, but they need to communicate safely with one another. And what they are asking for from the outside world is what is SDLAN, which is safe spaces for them to be provided to them. And this is something I think the internet companies outside, governments can do to allow Iranians just to speak with one another.
Yeah.
It's not, yes.
Absolutely. And I want to get back to you on that because I think one of the important takeaways from this panel has to be what can each and every person in this room do to help? What can we do to ensure that their voices continue to be heard and that action be taken? But Roya, if I could just jump back over to you. I mean, what is your view of how long, given what you all have described up here, the magnitude of this movement, the fact that the eyes of the world are on Iran, how long, in your view, can Iran's political system stay closed?
Well, I think if the system opens up, it won't be the Islamic Republic anymore. It's a theocracy, and it's a theocracy. You mentioned the people who are flipping turbans, and actually they also are chanting, "Clerics get lost." This is a theocracy that has lost its Muslims. These kids have been bred and raised in the Islamic Republic. They were born there, they were educated through the system, and they are flipping turbans, which, by the way, is now having consequences. A 16-year-old boy was arrested for that and released and committed suicide, which tells us that something really bad has happened in there. And so they won't, but the Soviet Union organized its own transitions. A lot of governments organized its transition. So it's not impossible, and they will have a way to do that. They will have a way to present it as expedient and necessary. But this requires the international community to remain focused on Iran. This is a psychological warfare that the state is waging against the citizens. And in this warfare, they tell them that you're alone and no one cares. So far, the world has shown that they care and that there may be consequences. The Human Rights Council has created a mechanism to investigate, which is different from the last times, because now they are going to keep evidence that could be used in trials. But another thing that I personally want to say is that we have their narrative and there is other narratives about what's happening. But, we, like everyone else in Iran, in Algeria, in Morocco, in France, in the US, we are very diverse people. Don't call us the Muslim world. We are not the Muslim world. We have Jews, Christians, atheists, agnostics, Muslims who don't believe in this brand of Islam. So when you think about us, think about us as individuals with different views, different goals, different likes. We are not the Muslim world, as you are not the Christian world. And don't forget us. These kids, they need you. Participate in campaigns, like, retweet. It's not much. They're not asking much, but what you do makes them stay out in the streets and fight for dignity, because that's what they want. They want choice, they want dignity, and that has been denied. They have been denied, and that's what they want, and everyone can help. Thank you.
That's so important, and I wish we had more time to talk about this, because it's really arguably one of the most important issues that we're going to be addressing at this Women's Forum. Our time is pretty much up, but I do just want to, and I want to thank you all for coming here, but also for giving this audience ideas about what can be done to ensure that people's voices continue to be heard, whether it be safe spaces, you mentioned sort of, internet, and, obviously kind of keeping the eyes on the world on this, on what is happening. Just to wrap up, a few lyrics from the song that we heard at the opening, which mean so much, which represent so much. This is just a few of the lyrics, but they go for dancing in the streets, for my sister, your sister, our sisters, for yearning for a just and normal life. And we all need to remember that. And please, we're going to move on now to a free time, a kind of a cocktail hour, but please use that time to come up and meet our panelists and talk to them one-on-one individually about what you can do and about how you can get involved and make sure that you help make a difference and that we keep this movement really under the eyes of the world. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Really an honor. And a round of applause for all of the protesters in Iran and around the world. Applause for our panelists and for all of the protesters.
Bravo.
This is for them. Yes. Just say it.
Bravo. Bravo. Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you to all of you for being with us this evening and for your incredibly powerful words. And I'm sure all of us in the auditorium will be thinking about what you've said, and we're all with you. So thank you so much for being here and taking the time. We appreciate it so much to each and every one of you. Liz, thank you so much for moderating.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Please.